Hey, in this video I'm going to talk about the five aggregates, which is a pretty direct thing from the Buddhist scriptures, where they are essentially forming a model of consciousness, and is very useful in meditation when you're doing the sort of contemplative meditation, and you can essentially use these five aggregates to analyze what's going on within your mind and essentially use it as a system of elements where each of the elements, instead of being like components of like natural materials, it's just the components of your direct experience and the things that you're experiencing like moment by moment. And just really quick, it is the five aggregates are consciousness, perception, feelings, form, and mental fabrications. And each of these terms is a translation of a Pali term, which Pali is the language they use for Buddhism. And because of that, each one is kind of an inexact definition, or like an inexact name. And I think it works well enough for perception and feeling, and form as well. But consciousness is, in translations they'll translate it as consciousness or mind or I think those are the main ones. But it's essentially like the container of the mind. And mental fabrications is also called what mental formations. I think like convolutions, um, like consciousness. This is slightly different, but it's like consciousness co-committance, like things that occur alongside consciousness, and and yeah, I'll yeah, there's so much to get into with each one. I'm thinking I'll eventually make a video about each one and just like deep dive into really like how you can view each one as like a part of the mind, a part of the experience. But before I get too much into what each one is and the way they interact, I want to address the name of like this whole system is the five aggregates. And the reason that they're called aggregates is because they are um, essentially each one is like a gathering together, like an aggregation, the conglomeration of. Um, you could think of it as like a deeper uh, essence, like a deeper material that actually comes together and forms each of these things. And on a really like on really like the true level, true as in like the truth that you're supposed to be able to find through meditation. Each one of these is described as being empty, and emptiness in this context is essentially saying that none of these five things has any sort of essential quality, and it's not a fundamental part of existence. And it's very hard to think logically in that way. So I think it's useful to think on one level of each of these things being composed of like smaller components, and whether those smaller components themselves are multiple different things, or if they're all just a lot of pieces of the same like unified thing. That's not too important, because that way of thinking about things, the way of thinking of the aggregates as literally being aggregated material, is kind of a midway point between the conventional understanding of, like perception is a real thing, feelings are a real thing, and kind of the ultimate truth, uh, which is that these things are completely essenceless and have no actual existence at all, and are merely an illusion formed by the the delusions of the mind. And yeah, I think this is really the way I tend to approach things, I guess, which isn't necessarily the way everyone does it, and especially in common like Buddhist like Dharma talks, like sermons, essentially, they'll tend to say one way or the other, and usually they tend towards saying that everything is empty and everything is like an illusion. But the way I do it is that I tend to think of things in a lot of different ways, and I think it's useful because there's a lot of different situations where you can apply these concepts, and just sticking to like a single way is just kind of limits the scope of each of the different models that Buddhism has. Because yeah, the five aggregates is just one of the many models, like the Four Noble Truths, or the Eightfold Path, or the I think there's at least one or two more that are kind of like a comprehensive model of the world. Dependent origination, which I'll talk about one day. That is like, I think one of the most comprehensive, but the most confusing and difficult to explain or even think about. But yeah, all of these things are themselves like complete models of consciousness, and you can use each one in kind of a different context and in different ways to essentially augment contemplative practice, and to provide like an understanding of the world that you can use as a tool for your own understanding. And yeah, so that kind of is the introduction of like what it means by five aggregates, and yeah, how this type of model should be used, and I guess why you should bother caring about how Buddhism describes the mind in this way. But yeah, so I'll just go through and yeah, it's kind of a hard thing to approach. I'll quickly give like a kind of a schematic of the five aggregates, and then go into depth in each one, and describe the way it can be applied. So essentially, you can think of the mind. So like the experience that we have moment to moment, on the surface, is composed of the interplay between perception and feelings. And the key is that perception and feeling only exist together, and there is no perception without feeling, and there's no feeling without perception. But fundamentally, they're very different things, because feeling is essentially the quality, it's almost like the color of an experience. And on a very basic level, you have a pleasant feeling, an unpleasant feeling, and neutral feeling. But there's many more to that you can divide it into. And in response to these types of feelings, perception is a process that's guided by the conditionings of your mind, and depending on the situation, it forms into a completely different process. But perception is what allows us to interpret feelings and essentially reference them to some system that happens within our mind. You can think of it as memory, or like the conditionings, or there's many different words you can put on the thing that perception is interacting with in order to interpret feelings. But perception is essentially the quality, the process that occurs in response to the quality of an experience. And so you have this kind of cycle. You can think of it as a cycle, or just like a kind of a one-way like incoming of feelings, which through the process of perception are turned into mental formations. And mental formations are definitely the most complicated aggregate, because they compose so much of what we experience. And if you think of feelings as like the quality of the experience, perception as the process that allows us to interpret experience, the mental fabrications are really what happens as a result of that. And it includes thoughts, you can say language, like language itself is a form of mental fabrication, but it's also emotions, because feelings are a response to they're a response to things around us, and response to things within us. But feeling in this context isn't an emotional feeling; it's more just like a coloring of experience. Whereas mental fabrications are really like the emotions that we talk about, like joy or sadness or anger. Like these things they're occurring purely within our being, within our mind, within our body. And one of the essential attributes of a mental formation is that it's very cyclical, and once a mental fabrication forms, it persists for some amount of time, and it does so by forming a cycle. And the cycle, you can't really, I can't really explain how the cycle works, but it involves the mental fabrication essentially hiding from. It's like the mental fabrication exists out of equilibrium with the more essential nature of things, so it has to hide from the kind of the peaceful like field of mind that acts as like a substrate for these things, and within that substrate, these smaller cycles will form, and it forms essentially like a region where there's a lot of stuff happening, and it creates an illusion of separateness from the overall substrate. And this is how you can interpret the idea that it's a fabrication, or like or something that forms from like nothingness, from kind of the pure unification. And it forms from that by creating this type of self-sustaining cycle that is essentially supplied by perception, and perception being fed by feelings. It all leads into these cycles, which essentially present themselves within the mind in a bunch of different ways. In the form of thoughts, emotions, feelings. Thoughts and emotions. Man, it is so hard to talk on stuff like this. I'll take a breath. But yeah, so that's kind of the first three aggregates, with mental formations being one of the more complex ones, because it essentially forms all the contents of our mind. And anything that you think of as, like, this is what I'm thinking about, or this is what I believe, what I feel, all of those fall into the realm of mental fabrication, mental formation. And it can happen on very short terms, with like a transient thought, but it can also be a very long-term thing with like firmly held beliefs. Like if you believe anything really, like you believe a good one. You believe that Jesus, I don't want to talk about any established like religion or anything. I'm looking at a log right here. If you believe that mushrooms are a very important part of nature, regardless of how true the belief is, the belief exists in your mind as a mental fabrication that is only persistent because it is feeding back into itself and justifying its own existence. And alongside that, it also is forming a relationship with the perception process, where perception occurs both on its own and in a relation to specific mental fabrications. So you'll, like if you see mushrooms on logs, you'll consistently perceive the mushrooms as something that's important. And you're doing that partly because of what you see. Maybe you see the log slowly decomposing, and that's an important thing. But you also do that because their perception process is referencing back to the mental fabrication that you have without actually referencing the reality around you. Whew. But yeah, I'm getting a little bit into the weeds with the first three, because those essentially form like the center of the process, the process of consciousness. And consciousness itself, as one of the five aggregates, is I've already said the word a number of times without specifically saying what it is, but consciousness is essentially the thing which holds all of these other aggregates, and and it has its own qualities to it, and kind of because it's an aggregate, it is inevitably going to have some type of quality to it, because there's many different types of consciousness which occur, and there's consciousness which it kind of, this contradicts a little what I was saying about mental fabrications being the same thing as emotions, because they describe consciousness as essentially having the types of consciousness being different emotions, or different like states of like a distracted mind or a concentrated mind, or I want to say like an angry mind or a calm mind. It's a lot of these dualities of consciousness, where consciousness can essentially hold the other aggregates in a configuration that is based on the type of consciousness that's occurring. So like a calm consciousness contains within it calm mental fabrications, and it interacts with the world through calm perception. Whereas an aggravated mind, aggravated mind would have, chaotic mental fabrications, and would view things through like angry perceptions. And this is a very important thing, that the feelings themselves, like the positive, negative, neutral feelings, would also be affected by the consciousness, because the feelings aren't some absolute thing. They're not some fundamental thing that is being received from the outside. They themselves are dependent on the perception that's occurring. And so, exposed to the same external phenomenon, two different consciousness states would experience different feelings from it. And this is obvious if you think of, like, some people like certain things and some people hate certain things. Like if you're watching like a TV show or something, and some person is watching it and they love the characters on it, they'll get all sorts of pleasant feelings from it. But if somebody thinks that the show is terrible or something, they'll get all sorts of unpleasant feelings. And neither of these are based on the actual external phenomenon. They're based on the kind of the interplay of all of these different things. The memories that take form as mental fabrications, the mood they're in, which takes form as the consciousness state, and the perceptions which take form as the process of interpreting those external phenomenon and the feelings that they present. And yeah, before I realize I'm kind of summing things up without saying the last aggregate. The last aggregate is form, which I've said external phenomenon, which that's essentially what form is. And it gets a little confusing when you read about the sense bases in Buddhism, because the sense bases are like the six senses that we talk about. Like the sight, sound, taste, smell, tactile, like bodily sensation, and the sixth one would be the mental sense, which is a little confusing, but it's essentially based on the mental fabrication. It's like you have feelings based on the things going on within your mind, and the feelings aren't coming from outside; they're coming directly from things within your mind, and that forms like that mental sense. And so form, in this case, is, in the case of the senses, form refers to things that you see. But in the context of the five aggregates, form consists of all of the external things that you sense. So you would say that things that you hear are also a form in the world around you, but I think for thinking about it metaphorically, you can just think of like form are the things around you, and form is like what you see around you. And yeah, this distinction I guess isn't super important, but just to be really clear and specific, talking about form in terms of what you see is leaving out the fact that the aggregate of form is also things that you hear and feel and taste and smell. But yeah, form is on the surface kind of the easiest one to understand because you can just look, have your eyes open, and you see all the forms around you, all like the shapes and the objects and everything. But it is just as deep as the other aggregates because on some level, the forms that you see are basically like a gathering, like an aggregation of a lot of different smaller forms. So if you look at like a pile of rocks, the pile itself is a form, but each of the rocks is also a form. And if you pick up one of the rocks and look closely at it, you'll see textures, and you'll see maybe it's a rock composed of different minerals. And it's like each of those minerals is its own form. And even going down to the level of atoms and subatomic particles, each of those is also a form. So form is a very strange, very like fractal type of aggregate, which I think with enough inward like insight ability, like if you can really see what's going on in your mind, I'm sure it would also have that quality of being like a lot of smaller parts forming into larger aggregates. And I think form is just like the easiest one to do, to view in that way. Simply because we can view things from far away and then get close and view them from closer. But yeah, just as a part of this system of 5 aggregates, the form can essentially just be seen as what is like coming into your mind, and what is the source of feelings, and yeah, I think I'll just give a quick summary, kind of going from like the outside in. You have the aggregate of forms, which compose what at least appears to be like a reality around us. And those forms come into contact with consciousness through the interchange of perception and feelings, where feelings are, broadly speaking, pleasant and unpleasant and neutral, and give a quality and a color to the action of perceiving forms. And perception, in addition to forming the ability for us to have these feelings, it also is a process that results in the interpretation of feelings and the moment-by-moment understanding of what's going on. And it does this in part by having its own continuing cycle of perceiving and feeling, and sort of using this process as a way of checking what's going on outside and checking what's going on inside. But it's dependent also, the perception, in addition to being dependent on the feelings, is dependent on the mental fabrications, which should maybe say that I don't know for sure that what I just said is true in the Buddhist scriptures, but I think that's a fair way to look at it. That perception is kind of checking in on these mental formations to determine how to perceive things. And the mental formations are, they represent many different things in our minds. And in a lot of ways, it can just be described as the contents of mind, because it includes thoughts, ongoing emotions, beliefs, anything that it kind of has that quality to it of of a like a cyclical, lasting phenomenon in our mind is a form of mental fabrication. And finally, the fifth aggregate is consciousness. Yeah, they're not really in order, of course, but in this scheme, the fifth aggregate is consciousness, which contains all of the other ones, and also contributes its own shading of the experience. Like if you think of feelings as being the colors, kind of like the drops of color that are being added to consciousness. Consciousness is like a slightly longer term process, which kind of just gives like a shading, like a lighting to the environment of the other five aggregates, the other four aggregates. And I think the final thing to mention about them is that form, even though form is best explained as happening on the outside and sort of coming into consciousness through feelings, it's very important to understand that these are all a part of the single system of like the aggregated world. And so it's not really proper to say that form is outside of consciousness, because consciousness and form are dependent on each other in the way that perception and feeling are dependent on each other. And that's to say that there wouldn't be forms around us if there wasn't a consciousness to interact with the forms. Because as I was saying, that forms are, like there's a pile of rocks, there's the individual rocks, there's components of the rocks. Those delineations are only made by consciousness. And without consciousness, there wouldn't even be the pile, because it would all just be, subatomic particles that weren't like sectioned off into these form shapes that consciousness then decides are these like fundamental things that can be identified as like a lasting form in the world. And this kind of comes full circle to the idea that these aren't, it's really more of what they aren't. The aggregates aren't something that is, my back is hurting from sitting so much. They aren't something that is fundamental to existence, and not just on the level of being like tools that we use to describe things, but they're not fundamental in the sense that like consciousness isn't a like immovable facet of existence. Like it's not a fundamental aspect of like existence has this aggregate. It's more the sense of at least in the way I presented it initially, it's that either these five aggregates are composed of kind of a coming together of some more fundamental substrate, which you can either think of as being composed of another set of elements, or you can think of as being composed of just like a single unified field. And it's through that coming together that these five aggregates appear to act in the way that they act. And it's like, you can even think of it as like perception is consciousness, just twisted in a certain way, where instead of holding things, it carries things. And consciousness is just perception, which is acting very slowly, and is acting slow enough that it has time to hold a smaller perceptive process inside of it. And this gets into the way that you can use these for contemplation, because you can essentially replace one aggregate with the other and say that, form is actually a mental fabrication, or feeling is actually a form. And this kind of just like contorts your mind in different ways that, because of the aggregated nature of these things, they are essentially interchangeable and can be, it's like your mind can be put into this this kind of switched around position where like mental fabrications are taking the place of form, but through the meditative process you can kind of reconnect the system and realign things so that it makes just as much sense as the more traditional sequence of forms being forms and mental fabrications being mental fabrications. And yeah, so I think I broke a thought there. Yeah, I was saying, so yeah, one way of doing it one way of seeing the things is as aggregated pieces of a larger substrate, or like a deeper substrate. But the real fundamental way to see it, that arguably is the way to reach like the more clarified mind, and isn't the only way to use these things, but is arguably the more like correct way to do it, and the way that's more supported by the Buddhist scriptures, is to identify these things and remember the knowledge that they are empty, and that consciousness is just an illusion that occurs, and feelings are just an illusion. Even though we think the feelings are real, the feelings aren't actually occurring. They're just an aggregation of other things, like other conditionings, other just like non-being components. And you see, it's very hard to talk in this way because you can't actually identify what they are, because emptiness says that they aren't anything at all, and that their existence is a transient, illusory phenomenon. And yeah, I guess I just don't talk that way that much, because it's almost impossible to really talk that way without very quickly just getting to the thing of like, oh yeah, nothing is real, all is illusions. But I think it is important to at least say that every once in a while, to remember that really is the core of these practices, is like meandering around and understanding things in a lot of different ways, but always coming back to that knowledge that, reality is some type of illusion, and there's so many different things you can do with the illusion, but you'll gain the most accurate knowledge, and the most, you'll just the insights that you get will be real insights when you make sure that you don't forget the possibility, essentially, the possibility of everything being an illusion. But yeah, I won't get too much into that topic today, because while that is an important part of the aggregates, the seeing them as illusions, it that whole idea of kind of like the non-duality of these things is, yeah, its own topic, and something I'll talk about someday. But yeah, I really just went right ahead in that video. It's all the fun talking about this type of stuff, because it feels like there's so much to say about these things, because I don't know, there's just like, you can spend hours and hours meditating on these things, and just like reforming better and better understandings of what these aggregates are. But yeah, I guess a summary to the summary is yeah, the five aggregates are consciousness, mental fabrications, perception, form, and feeling. And you can use these things as a practice of contemplation, and a practice of just identifying things that are happening within your mind. And there's so many different things you can do with them, so many different ways you can understand them. But fundamentally, they are just another tool and just another system that Buddhism presents sort of as like an offering to your practice, rather than as being a fundamental declaration of how the world works, because nobody knows how the world works, especially not a book or a person, but yeah, that's about it, I guess. Hope you enjoyed this this sort of long-term long form video. I think I'm gonna start doing like half short videos and half long videos, because that feels like a pretty good balance, at least for now. Yeah, like, comment, subscribe, and contemplate. Peace.